The year was 1972, and America was still reeling from the longest war in its history. Vietnam had left its mark on everyone, from the protesters in Washington to the families waiting at airports, hoping their sons would come home. But this story isn't about the battlefields of Southeast Asia or the protests that tore the country apart. This is about what happened when one man came home and discovered that some secrets were never meant to stay buried. Robert Mitchell was the kind of guy you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Average height, brown hair starting to thin at 32, and a face that carried the weight of someone who'd seen too much but said too little. He'd spent 3 years in Vietnam, working as a communications specialist for the army, which was a fancy way of saying he listened to radio chatter and made sure the right messages got to the right people. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it was important, and Robert took pride in doing it well. When he finally touched down at San Francisco International Airport in March of 1972, Robert expected to feel relief. Instead, he felt nothing. The crowd was smaller than he'd imagined. No protesters with signs, no welcoming committee. Just tired travelers rushing to catch their next flight, and a few families waiting at the gates. His own family wasn't there. His parents had passed away while he was overseas, and his younger sister lived somewhere in Oregon now, though they hadn't spoken in years. Robert collected his duffel bag from baggage claim and took a cab to a cheap motel in Oakland, where he planned to figure out what the rest of his life was supposed to look like. For the first few weeks, Robert kept to himself. He'd wake up around noon, eat breakfast at a diner down the street, and spend the rest of the day walking around the city or sitting in his motel room watching television. The news was full of stories about the war, about Nixon and Watergate, about things that felt both urgent and completely irrelevant to his life. He applied for a few jobs, nothing special, just warehouse work or delivery driving, anything to keep busy. But something was eating at him, something he couldn't quite name. It started with the dreams. Every night, Robert would find himself back in the communications tent outside Da Nang, headphones pressed against his ears, listening to voices crackling through static. But in the dreams, the voices said things he didn't remember hearing, talked about operations he'd never been briefed on, mentioned names and locations that felt familiar but wrong somehow. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, his heart racing, trying to piece together what was real and what his mind had invented. At first, he chalked it up to stress, to the normal adjustment period every veteran went through. But the dreams got more specific, more insistent, and Robert started to wonder if maybe his subconscious was trying to tell him something. One afternoon in late April, Robert was eating lunch at his usual diner when he overheard 2 men talking in the booth behind him. They were speaking quietly, but Robert had spent years training his ears to pick up conversations through radio static, and old habits die hard. One of them mentioned Operation Phoenix, a CIA program in Vietnam that Robert knew about from his time overseas. But then the other man said something that made Robert's blood run cold. He mentioned coordinates, specific grid references that Robert recognized immediately. They were talking about a mission that had happened in late 1971, just a few months before Robert left Vietnam. A mission that was supposed to be routine recon, but had ended with an entire village disappeared from the map. Robert had been on duty that night. He'd logged the communications, filed the reports, done everything by the book. The official story was that the village had been evacuated due to enemy activity, that everyone had been relocated safely to a secure area. But listening to these 2 men talk, hearing them laugh about how clean the operation had gone, how nobody would ever know what really happened, Robert felt something shift inside him. This wasn't about evacuations or safety. This was about something much darker, something that had been carefully hidden behind military jargon and classified stamps. He didn't confront the men. That would have been stupid and dangerous. Instead, he waited until they left, paid his bill, and followed them at a distance. They walked 3 blocks to a nondescript office building, the kind of place that could house anything from an insurance company to a law firm, and disappeared inside. Robert stood across the street for a long time, watching the windows, trying to decide what to do next. He knew he should walk away, forget what he'd heard, get on with his life. But he also knew that if he did that, he'd never be able to sleep again. The next morning, Robert went to the public library. He spent hours in the reference section, looking through newspapers and magazines from late 1971, trying to find any mention of the village or the operation. There was nothing, no articles, no reports, not even a brief mention in the war coverage. It was as if the place had never existed. But Robert knew it had. He'd seen it on maps, heard it mentioned in radio traffic, watched supply convoys head in that direction. A whole community of people couldn't just vanish without someone noticing. He started keeping a journal, writing down everything he could remember about that night. The times, the call signs, the voices he'd heard over the radio. Some of it was clear, burned into his memory with the kind of detail that only comes from repetition and routine. Other parts were fuzzy, distorted by time and trauma, but the more he wrote, the more convinced he became that something terrible had happened, and that people far above his pay grade had worked very hard to make sure nobody ever found out about it. Robert knew he needed proof. Memories and overheard conversations weren't enough. He needed documents, records, something concrete that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. The problem was that everything from his time in Vietnam was classified, locked away in filing cabinets in some military facility where he'd never be able to reach it. Or at least, that's what he thought, until he remembered something his old sergeant used to say. The military might be good at keeping secrets, but it was terrible at keeping track of paperwork. Every unit kept duplicate records. It was standard procedure, a way to make sure that if one set of documents got lost or destroyed, there'd be a backup somewhere. Robert had been trained to file everything in triplicate, 1 copy for the daily log, 1 for the weekly report, and 1 for his own files. He'd kept that 3rd copy with him throughout his deployment, storing them in a footlocker that he'd shipped back to the States when his tour ended. That footlocker was sitting in a storage facility in Sacramento, where he'd paid for 6 months up front before coming home. It took him 2 days to get there. He didn't have a car, so he took a Greyhound bus that stopped in every small town along the way, filling up with farm workers and college students and other people just trying to get from one place to another. When he finally arrived at the storage facility, it was early evening, the sun starting to set behind the mountains in the distance. The manager was an older woman who barely looked up from her magazine when Robert showed his rental agreement and asked for access to his unit. The footlocker was exactly where he'd left it, covered in dust and sitting in the corner of a 10 by 10 space that held everything he owned in the world. Robert knelt down, his hands shaking slightly as he undid the latches and lifted the lid. Inside were uniforms, medals he'd never bothered to display, a few photographs, and beneath all of that, a thick manila envelope filled with papers. He pulled it out carefully, almost reverently, and started going through the pages. It was all there. Radio logs, communication transcripts, operational summaries, months' worth of documentation from his time in Vietnam, all neatly organized and filed according to military protocol. Robert flipped through them quickly at first, looking for anything from late 1971, and then he found it. November 23rd, 1971. Grid coordinates matching exactly what he'd overheard in the diner. And there, in his own handwriting, notes about unusual radio traffic, about orders that came through channels he didn't recognize, about a conversation between 2 officers discussing asset removal and cleanup protocols. At the time, Robert hadn't understood what any of it meant. He'd just done his job, logged the information, and moved on to the next transmission. But now, with the benefit of distance and the context of that overheard conversation, the pieces started falling into place. Asset removal didn't mean evacuating villagers, it meant eliminating them. Cleanup protocols weren't about securing an area, they were about making sure no evidence remained. Back in Oakland, Robert started making phone calls. He reached out to veterans groups, to anti-war organizations, to anyone who might be able to help him figure out his next move. Most people weren't interested. Some thanked him for his service and hung up. Others suggested he talk to a therapist, that maybe the stress of readjustment was making him see conspiracies where none existed. A few were more sympathetic, but explained that they were overwhelmed with their own cases, their own battles, and didn't have the resources to take on something like this. It was frustrating and isolating, but Robert kept trying. He spent his days in phone booths and libraries, researching, making notes, building a case that he hoped someone would eventually care about. His money was running low. The motel wanted payment every week, and the odd jobs he'd managed to pick up weren't enough to cover his expenses and fund his investigation. He started skipping meals, eating once a day to stretch his budget, losing weight he couldn't afford to lose. Then, in mid-May, he got a break. One of the veterans organizations put him in touch with a journalist named Sarah Chen, who worked for a small independent newspaper in Berkeley. Sarah was young, maybe 25, with long black hair and the kind of intensity that came from believing journalism could actually change things. She agreed to meet Robert at a coffee shop near campus, and he brought the documents with him, laying them out on the table between their cups like evidence at a trial. Sarah read through everything carefully, asking questions, taking notes, her expression growing more serious with each page. When she finally looked up at Robert, there was something in her eyes that he recognized. It was the same look he'd seen in the mirror every morning since that day in the diner, the look of someone who'd stumbled onto something they couldn't ignore. She told him it was explosive, that if even half of what he was saying was true, it could be one of the biggest stories to come out of the war. But she also warned him that going public would be dangerous. The people responsible for something like this wouldn't want it exposed, and they had resources and connections that neither of them could match. Robert said he understood the risks, that he'd already made his decision. Sarah nodded, told him she needed a few days to verify some details and talk to her editor, and they agreed to meet again the following week. Those few days felt like an eternity. Robert tried to keep busy, but his mind kept racing through all the possible outcomes. Maybe Sarah would write the story and people would care. Maybe it would lead to an investigation, to accountability, to some kind of justice for the people who died. Or maybe nothing would happen. Maybe the story would get buried, dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized veteran, and everything would go back to the way it was. On the day they were supposed to meet again, Robert showed up at the coffee shop early. He ordered tea he didn't drink and watched the door, waiting for Sarah to arrive. 20 minutes passed, then 30, then an hour. She didn't show up. He tried calling the newspaper from a payphone outside, but the receptionist said Sarah hadn't come into work that day, that she'd called in without explanation. Robert felt his stomach drop. Something was wrong. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more forgotten tales of American heroes, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. It really helps us keep bringing these stories to light. He went to the newspaper office anyway, hoping to find someone who could tell him what was going on. The building was small, tucked between a bookstore and a laundromat, with a cramped lobby that smelled like ink and old paper. The receptionist told him again that Sarah wasn't in, that she didn't know when she'd be back, and suggested he try calling tomorrow. Robert didn't believe her. He could see it in the way she avoided eye contact, the way her hand trembled slightly when she picked up a pen. Someone had gotten to Sarah, or to the newspaper, or both. They'd been warned off the story, told to drop it or face consequences, and now Robert was alone again, holding evidence that nobody wanted to see. That's when Robert noticed the car. It was a dark sedan, parked across the street from the newspaper office. Two men sat in the front seat watching. They weren't trying to hide. They wanted him to see them, wanted him to know he was being followed. Robert's heart started pounding. He turned down a side street, walking faster, and the car pulled out, keeping pace with him. Robert spent the next few days moving carefully, staying in public places, keeping to crowded streets. He ended up working on a new plan at an all-night diner in downtown Oakland. If traditional journalism wasn't going to work, if going to the authorities was too risky, he needed another approach. And then he remembered something he'd heard about during his time in the service. There were people in Washington, staffers and low-level bureaucrats, who kept track of things that fell through the cracks. One name kept coming to mind: Thomas Brennan. Robert had never met him personally, but he'd heard stories. Brennan worked as a file clerk at the Department of Defense, had been there for 20 years, and supposedly had access to records that most people didn't even know existed. More importantly, he had a reputation for helping veterans who'd been wronged by the system. Getting to Washington meant crossing the country with almost no money, but Robert didn't see any other choice. He bought a ticket to Washington, D.C. with money he'd been saving for rent, knowing that when he got there, he'd be essentially homeless, but hopefully alive. The bus trip took 3 days. Robert barely slept, keeping the envelope clutched against his chest, watching every passenger who got on or off. When the bus finally pulled into the station in Washington, it was early morning, the city just starting to wake up. He found a payphone and looked up Thomas Brennan's number in the directory. On his third try, a man's voice answered, cautious and quiet. Robert explained who he was, what he had, why he needed help. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Brennan spoke, asking specific questions about the documents. After a few minutes, he told Robert to meet him at a park near the Lincoln Memorial at noon, to come alone. At noon exactly, Robert walked to the designated park. Thomas Brennan was easy to spot, an older man in a brown suit sitting on a bench reading a newspaper. Robert sat down beside him, and they talked for almost an hour. Brennan examined the documents carefully, asked questions about Robert's service record and why he'd decided to come forward. Finally, Brennan handed the papers back and told Robert that what he had was genuine, that it corroborated other information that had been circulating through certain channels. But there was a problem. The right people weren't easy to reach, and the process could take months or even years. In the meantime, Robert would be vulnerable. Brennan said he could help, that he knew people who could provide protection. But Robert would have to trust him completely, would have to be willing to go underground for a while. Robert didn't hesitate. Brennan nodded and told Robert to follow a specific set of directions that would lead him to a safe location. The safe house was in Arlington, a modest 2-story home on a quiet street. Robert was met at the door by a woman named Margaret, probably in her 50s, with grey hair and a kind face. She showed him to a room upstairs and told him the rules, mainly to stay inside and keep away from windows. Days turned into weeks. Brennan visited twice during that time, bringing updates. The documents had been passed along to a congressional aide who was interested in investigating military operations in Vietnam. There was talk of a possible hearing, but everything depended on political timing and whether they could build enough support. In July, things started moving faster. The congressional aide had found other veterans willing to talk about similar operations. There was a pattern emerging, evidence of systematic cover-ups involving multiple incidents across Vietnam. What Robert had witnessed wasn't an isolated event, but part of something much larger. But success brought danger. Brennan warned Robert that people were asking questions about him, that his name had come up in conversations, that there were forces working to discredit him before he could testify. They spread rumors that he was unstable, that his service record showed signs of problems. None of it was true, but they were good at shaping perception. Robert told Brennan he was ready to testify, ready to go public, ready to face whatever consequences came from speaking the truth. The hearing was scheduled for late August, a closed-door session with a select committee. Robert would testify, along with 2 other veterans who'd come forward. Brennan cautioned him that even if everything went well, the chances of real accountability were slim. The war was winding down, public attention was focused elsewhere, but maybe they could get some recognition that what happened was wrong. The night before the hearing, Robert couldn't sleep. He thought about the village, about the people whose names he'd never known. He thought about all the other stories that would never be told. And he thought about himself, about the quiet kid from California who'd served his country faithfully and who'd come home to discover that sometimes doing the right thing meant standing up against the very institutions you'd been trained to trust. The hearing room was smaller than Robert expected. The committee members were there, 5 of them, looking tired and skeptical. The other veterans who were supposed to testify hadn't shown up. Robert was on his own. He told his story clearly and calmly, walking through the documents, explaining what each one meant. The committee members asked questions, some hostile, some genuinely curious. One of them, a senator from the Midwest, seemed particularly interested. After 3 hours, it was over. The chairman thanked Robert for his service, said they'd review everything carefully. It was the kind of polite dismissal that meant, don't hold your breath. But then something unexpected happened. As Robert was gathering his documents, the senator from the Midwest approached him quietly. He said that what Robert had presented was compelling, that he planned to push for a full investigation regardless of what the rest of the committee decided. He asked if Robert would be willing to testify again if needed, publicly this time, and Robert said yes without hesitation. Over the next few months, things slowly began to change. Articles started appearing in major newspapers about broader questions regarding operations in Vietnam. Congressional pressure mounted for greater transparency. The senator, whose name was Harrison, became a leading voice calling for accountability. Robert stayed in the safe house through the fall, watching events unfold from a distance. His testimony had been the catalyst for several other veterans coming forward. It wasn't the dramatic resolution Robert had imagined, no arrests or trials, but it was something. It was the beginning of a conversation that needed to happen. In December, Senator Harrison's committee released a preliminary report acknowledging that there had been systematic failures in oversight of certain military operations in Vietnam. It was bureaucratic language, but it was also an official admission that something had gone wrong. For Robert, it felt like vindication, small and incomplete, but real. Brennan told him it was safe to leave the safe house now. Robert packed his belongings, thanked Margaret, and stepped out into the cold December air a different person. He didn't go back to California. Instead, he stayed in Washington, finding a small apartment and a job working at a veterans outreach center, helping other veterans navigate the system. Years passed, the war ended, Vietnam became history, and the country moved on. The investigation never produced sweeping reforms, but it did lead to changes in how operations were documented, small improvements that might prevent similar cover-ups in the future. The village that had sparked everything never got justice in any traditional sense, but Robert made sure it wasn't completely forgotten. He wrote down everything he remembered and filed it with organizations that documented human rights violations. Maybe someday someone would read those records and care. Robert Mitchell died in 2003 at the age of 63. The people who knew what he'd done remembered him differently. To them, he represented something important about what it means to serve your country, not just by following orders, but by holding the powerful accountable. His story wasn't dramatic or headline-grabbing, but it mattered. It still matters, because history isn't just made by the loud and the famous, but also by the quiet and the determined, by people who do what's right, not because they'll be rewarded or remembered, but simply because it needs to be done.